Welcome to Mr. Kelin Stories. I'm so glad you're here today. Before we dive into an incredible tale, I want to take a moment to pray for all of you watching. May your hearts be filled with joy, your dreams be within reach, and may you always find happiness in the little moments. Now, get ready for a story that will touch your heart, fill you with suspense, and maybe even make you believe in the magic of unexpected love. If you enjoy the story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment below. Your support means the world to me, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on the story. Share this with your friends, and let's keep building our amazing community of storytellers. Stay tuned for more exciting adventures, and let's get started. Lena Carter never thought her life would change with a single job. She had always been the kind of girl who took things as they came, never expecting grand adventures or thrilling mysteries. Her world had always been simple: school, part-time jobs, and dreams of a better future. But this job offer was different. It wasn't the usual babysitting gig or working late hours at a diner. This was house sitting, and not just for any house. When she first saw the listing, she thought it was a mistake. Why would someone trust a small-town girl like her to look after a place that looked like it belonged in a movie? But the pay was generous, almost too generous. It was enough to cover her college tuition for an entire semester. That kind of money didn't come often, so she said yes. The moment she arrived at the mansion, she felt something stir deep in her chest, a strange mix of awe and unease. The house stood tall and proud on the hill, surrounded by thick iron gates and ancient oak trees. Its dark stone walls looked both elegant and intimidating, as if they held secrets too old to be spoken aloud. The assistant who hired her, a sharply dressed woman named Ms. Caldwell, barely gave her time to admire the place before listing the rules in a firm, clipped voice. Stay inside at night. The town was small and the mansion was isolated. It was safer this way. Do not enter the West Wing. It was off limits. No explanations. Just a rule that wasn't to be broken. Keep everything exactly as it is. No moving things, no rearranging. Lena nodded, though curiosity burned inside her. Who owned this place? Why was the West Wing forbidden? And why did this all feel wrong? A house that felt alive. Once inside, the air felt heavy, as if the house itself was watching her. The ceilings stretched high above, adorned with intricate chandeliers that shimmered like trapped stars. The walls were lined with portraits of serious-looking men in expensive suits, their gazes following her as she walked by. The living room was massive, with a fireplace large enough to stand in. The kitchen gleamed with polished marble countertops, and the grand staircase in the center of the house curled upward like something out of a fairy tale. Yet, despite its beauty, the house felt empty. It wasn't just the silence. It was the way shadows seemed to stretch a little too far, the way certain doors creaked open when no one was there. It was the way the wind howled through the old stone, whispering through the halls like a voice lost in time. Lena tried to shake off the unease. After all, it was just a house, right? A job too good to be true. For the first few hours, she wandered the mansion, marveling at its elegance. She found a massive library filled with books she could spend years reading. The garden outside was perfectly manicured, filled with roses that smelled sweeter than any she'd ever known. She should have felt lucky. But as she sat on the velvet couch that evening, staring into the flickering flames of the fireplace, something gnawed at her thoughts. Why would a man as rich as Ethan Blackwell need a stranger to watch his house? Why would someone with that much money not have a full-time staff? And why was she strictly forbidden from entering certain parts of the mansion? Lena locked the doors before heading upstairs to her room. The bed was enormous, the sheets silk beneath her fingertips. As exhaustion settled into her bones, she told herself she'd been overthinking. But then she shot up, heart hammering. A noise. From the West Wing. She held her breath, straining to listen. Silence. She told herself it was nothing, just the house settling, the wind playing tricks. But deep down, she knew something wasn't right. This house wasn't just a house. And she wasn't alone. At first, everything in the mansion seemed too perfect. Lena moved through the grand halls, running her fingers over the polished banisters and admiring the expensive artwork on the walls. The house was spotless, as if time had frozen here. The air smelled faintly of old books and lavender, and every room was bathed in a golden glow from the enormous chandeliers. She spent her mornings exploring. The kitchen was stocked with gourmet food, fresh fruits, rare cheeses, and chocolates wrapped in gold foil. The library was a dream, filled with shelves stretching up to the ceiling, stacked with books she never thought she'd see in real life. First editions, leather-bound novels with handwritten notes in the margins. For a few days, it felt like she had stepped into a fairy tale. But fairy tales always had a dark side. The whispers in the night. The first sign that something was wrong came on the third night. Lena had just settled into bed, the heavy silk blankets wrapping around her like a cocoon, when she heard it. A whisper. Software. Just a breath of a voice. Her body went rigid. She held her breath, waiting, listening. But the room was silent. Maybe she was just imagining things. Then she heard it again, whispering, faint, echoing down the halls. She bolted upright, her heart slamming against her ribs. The sound drifted from somewhere beyond her door, slipping through the cracks like fingers reaching for her. Was someone else here? She told herself it was the wind, that old houses made noises, that her mind was playing tricks. But when she reached for the lamp, the lights flickered. Once, twice, then they went out completely. Darkness swallowed the room. Lena's pulse raced as she grabbed her phone, using its faint glow to navigate. She peeked into the hallway, empty, but the whispering had stopped. The silence felt heavier than the noise. She didn't sleep that night. The next morning, Lena tried to ignore the unease. She told herself there was a logical explanation for everything. Maybe there was a draft causing the whispers. Maybe the electrical system was old. But then she started seeing things. Shadows where there shouldn't be any. A figure in the corner of her eye, gone the second she turned her head. A mirror in the hallway that, for just a split second, reflected a person standing behind her. But when she turned, no one was there. Her stomach churned with unease. She thought about calling Miss Caldwell, the assistant who had hired her. But what would she even say? Hey, your house is creeping me out. Can I quit? Instead, she distracted herself with books, long baths, and cooking extravagant meals in the kitchen. She pretended the house wasn't getting to her, until the night she found the door open. The west wing had always been locked. She had checked, twice. But that night, as she walked past, she noticed the door was slightly ajar. A sliver of darkness stretched out from the opening, curling into the hallway like smoke. Lena's breath hitched. Don't go in. Miss Caldwell's voice echoed in her mind, but curiosity burned through her like a wildfire. She had to know. With slow, hesitant steps, she pushed the door open. The air inside was colder, carrying the faint scent of old paper and something bitter, like faded memories and regret. The room was nothing like the others. It wasn't luxurious. It wasn't polished. It was a shrine to a man's past. Newspapers covered the walls, yellowed and fragile, their headlines screaming stories about the same name over and over again. Ethan Blackwell. Lena's hands trembled as she traced a finger over the articles. Ethan Blackwell, the reclusive CEO, shrouded in mystery. Billionaire genius hides from the world after tragic past. Photographs were pinned between the articles, some of a young Ethan, his face softer, less guarded. Others showed a man who looked like him but older, his father maybe. And then there were the paintings. Dark, intense pieces of art, some showing a faceless man, others showing a grand house that looked exactly like this one, engulfed in flames. Her stomach twisted. Why would a billionaire as powerful as Ethan Blackwell hide away in a house filled with memories of pain? Why did this wing feel like a graveyard of his past? And more importantly, why did she suddenly feel like she was being watched? Lena turned sharply. The door creaked as it moved behind her. Her breath caught. She wasn't alone. Lena lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her heart still hammering from what she had discovered in the West Wing. Sleep refused to come. The room felt too still, too silent, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Her mind replayed the images from earlier, the newspaper clippings, the paintings, the whispers in the dark halls, and above all, the name that had echoed through every piece of history in that forbidden room. Ethan Blackwell. She had accepted this job thinking she was working for a faceless billionaire who lived his life far away, too busy running an empire to care about a house in the middle of nowhere. But now everything felt off. If Ethan Blackwell was such a recluse, why did she feel like this house was haunted by his presence? The restless night. Lena tossed and turned, but sleep wouldn't come. A cold breeze crept in through the cracks of the old windows, making the curtains flutter like ghostly figures. The shadows seemed longer tonight, stretching and shifting as if they had minds of their own. Finally, she couldn't take it anymore. She needed to clear her head. Slipping out of bed, she wrapped a sweater around herself and made her way downstairs. The grand house was eerily quiet, her bare feet making no sound against the polished floors. She decided to make herself some tea, hoping the warmth would settle the uneasy feeling twisting in her stomach. The kitchen was dimly lit, the silver moonlight spilling through the large windows. She reached for the kettle, but then she froze. A stranger in the kitchen. Someone was standing by the window, tall, broad-shouldered, a man. Lena's breath caught in her throat. He stood with his back to her, his frame silhouetted against the night sky. The way he carried himself was almost unnatural, too still, too controlled, like a shadow come to life. Her mind screamed at her to run, but her body betrayed her, locked in place. Then, as if sensing her presence, the man slowly turned. Lena's breath hitched. He was devastatingly handsome in a sharp, untouchable kind of way. His features were chiseled, his jaw strong, his dark hair tousled in a way that looked effortlessly perfect. But it was his eyes that stole the air from her lungs, deep, piercing blue, like frozen lakes under moonlight. There was something about him, something dangerous, something magnetic, and yet something incredibly broken. "Who are you?" Lena's survival instincts kicked in. She grabbed the nearest weapon, a frying pan, and held it in front of her like a shield. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice steadier than she felt. The man didn't move. He just watched her, his gaze unreadable. Then, after a pause, he spoke, his voice deep and smooth, sending a strange shiver down her spine. "I should be asking you the same thing." Lena's grip on the frying pan tightened. Something about him felt familiar, but that was impossible. She had never met him before. Had she? Then suddenly the realization slammed into her. Ethan Blackwell. Her mouth went dry. I, I'm Lena Carter," she stammered. "Your house sitter." A flicker of amusement passed through his sharp features. His lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "So, you're the one keeping my house in order." Lena's heart pounded in her chest. He wasn't supposed to be here. Ms. Caldwell had told her he was away, miles from here. If that was true, then why was he standing in front of her now, looking at her as if she was the intruder? Lena didn't lower the frying pan. Something wasn't right. He didn't move like someone who had just come home from a long trip. He didn't look surprised to see her. He looked like someone who had been watching her. Her pulse roared in her ears. You weren't supposed to be back yet," she said carefully. Ethan's gaze darkened, his amusement fading. "And who told you that?" Lena swallowed hard. "Your assistant. She said you were away on business." For a moment, silence stretched between them. His jaw clenched, his hands tightening at his sides. A storm flickered behind those icy blue eyes, one she couldn't decipher. Then he sighed, running a hand through his dark hair. "I should have known," he murmured, almost to himself. "Known what?" Lena asked cautiously. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned back toward the window, staring into the endless darkness outside. His reflection in the glass looked almost haunted. "There are things about this house you don't understand," he said finally. His voice was softer now, edged with something she hadn't expected. Sadness. Lena felt her grip on the frying pan loosen. For the first time, she really looked at him. Not as the billionaire CEO whose name filled the headlines, not as the mysterious stranger who had appeared out of nowhere, but as a man who carried something heavy, a man who looked like he had spent years running from his own ghosts. Her heartbeat slowed, curiosity flickering through her fear. What was Ethan Blackwell hiding? The mansion no longer felt as eerie as before. Ethan Blackwell's presence, once a mystery wrapped in silence, was now something Lena was getting used to. She had expected him to send her away immediately, to demand answers, to call his assistant and fire whoever had hired her. But he didn't. Instead, he let her stay. He watched her, not in a predatory way, not like the shadows that had once haunted the halls, but in a way that made Lena feel like she was something unexpected, like he wasn't sure what to do with her. For the first day after their midnight encounter, Ethan barely spoke to her. He disappeared into his study or took long walks outside, always keeping a careful distance. Lena, unsure of her place now, kept busy. She cleaned, read, and tried to act as if her entire world hadn't just been turned upside down. But by the third day, things changed. She was in the kitchen, making herself breakfast, when Ethan walked in. He didn't say anything at first, just leaned against the counter, arms crossed, watching as she struggled to flip a pancake without ruining it. "Are you always this bad at cooking?" Lena nearly dropped the spatula. She turned to him, narrowing her eyes. "Excuse me?" His lips twitched. "You've burned 3 already." She looked down at the slightly charred pancakes on the plate and huffed. "They're not burned, they're just extra crispy." Ethan let out a short, unexpected chuckle. It was quiet, barely there, but it was real, and for the first time Lena saw it. A crack in the cold exterior, a glimpse of the man behind the billionaire, the weight of his past. As the days passed, Lena started to understand Ethan in a way she never thought possible. He wasn't cruel or heartless, as the media had painted him. He wasn't the untouchable, ruthless businessman they wrote about in magazines. He was just a man with a past woven with loss. Ethan had lost his parents when he was just a teenager. His father had been a powerful, ruthless businessman, one who had built an empire but never showed his son how to be loved. His mother had been the softer one, the light in the darkness. But when she passed away, Ethan had been left with nothing but shadows. Everything he had now, the wealth, the power, he had built on his own. But success had only brought isolation. Everyone who came into his life wanted something. Money, connections, influence. No one wanted him. So he had stopped trusting the world, stopped believing that anyone could see him for who he really was. Until Lena. A different kind of connection. Unlike everyone else, she wasn't intimidated by him. She didn't fawn over his money or tiptoe around him like his business partners did. She didn't ask him for anything, didn't try to impress him. She just existed, freely. She laughed when he least expected it. She spoke her mind, even when it meant challenging him. And slowly the walls Ethan had built so carefully over the years began to crack. The firelight conversation. One evening they sat by the grand fireplace. The flames flickered, casting golden light across Ethan's sharp features. The storm outside rattled the windows, but inside the world felt quiet. Ethan watched Lena as she stretched out on the couch, flipping through one of the many books from the library. She was different from anyone he had ever met, and he couldn't understand why she wasn't afraid of him. Finally, he asked the question that had been burning inside him for days. "Why aren't you afraid of me like everyone else?" Lena looked up, startled. She tilted her head, studying him. "What do you mean?" He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Most people either fear me or worship me. They see the name, the fortune. But you," he trailed off, shaking his head, "you act like I'm just—" "A person," Lena finished for him, a small smile tugging at her lips. Ethan met her gaze. "Yes." She closed the book and leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees. Her voice was soft but certain. "Because that's what you are, Ethan. A person. And you don't scare me." He felt something in his chest shift. It was the first time in years, maybe his entire life, that someone had said his name without hesitation, without awe, without fear. Just honesty. For a man who had spent his life locked behind a fortress of wealth and power, those simple words felt like a key, one that could finally set him free. The weeks that followed were a blur of laughter, quiet moments, and discoveries. Ethan Blackwell, the cold and distant billionaire who had once seemed untouchable, was no longer a mystery to Lena. In his presence, she had found not only comfort, but a connection she hadn't thought possible with someone so far removed from her world. They spent time walking through the grand estate, talking about their childhoods, their dreams, their fears. He shared stories of his rise to power, stories of a young man, lonely and determined, who had fought to make his place in the world without anyone to help him. Lena shared her own life, too, of a small-town girl trying to escape the shadow of poverty, working multiple jobs, and always trying to prove herself to a world that didn't believe she had the strength to rise above her circumstances. But together they had found something neither of them had expected. Ethan found laughter in the most unexpected places. Lena found a protector in a man who had once been too closed off to let anyone in, and yet, even in the midst of their growing closeness, there was an undercurrent of tension that neither of them could ignore. As Ethan and Lena's bond deepened, the whispers began. It started small, a comment here and there, a raised eyebrow when they were seen together. At first, Lena tried to ignore it. She was used to being an outsider. Being looked at like she didn't belong was nothing new, but the whispers grew louder. They spread like wildfire, catching the ears of people in the town. Why was the CEO of Blackwell Enterprises spending time with her, a girl with no pedigree, no family name, no standing in society? Some of the townspeople said it behind her back, while others said it to her face. "She doesn't belong in this world," one woman whispered as Lena passed her in the store. "She's nothing but a gold digger," another muttered, glaring at Lena from across the street. Lena's chest tightened every time she heard the judgment. The world didn't care about who she was or what she brought to the table. All they saw was the gap between her and Ethan. One evening, Ethan invited Lena to accompany him to a high-profile charity event in the city. It was a glittering affair, full of celebrities, politicians, and wealthy elites, people whose lives seemed as far removed from Lena's as possible. She was nervous, unsure of what to expect. Her clothes, though beautiful, didn't carry the same weight of luxury as the designer gowns and sparkling jewelry of the women around her. She felt like an imposter in a world she didn't belong to, but Ethan was beside her, his hand warm on the small of her back as he guided her through the crowd. When they entered the grand ballroom, all eyes were on them. Whispers rippled through the room like a wave. Lena could feel the judgment in the air. She could see it in the way some people looked at her with disdain, The way others tried to disappear her in the crowd. She tried to smile, but the weight of their gazes made her want to shrink. She wasn't a part of their world, and it didn't matter how kind or genuine Ethan was, she would never be accepted here. As they made their way to the center of the room, a wealthy businessman in a tailored suit leaned toward Ethan, his voice thick with disdain. "Ethan," he sneered, his eyes gliding over Lena with a look that made her skin crawl. "Shouldn't you be with someone more suitable?" Lena felt her stomach twist. She had heard these kinds of comments before, but it didn't make it any easier to bear. It didn't matter that she had never cared about money or status. She wasn't welcome. But before she could react, Ethan's voice rang out, strong and unwavering, cutting through the tension like a knife. "Lena is more than suitable," he said, his gaze locked on the businessman. "She's everything." Lena's heart skipped a beat. His words echoed in her chest like a promise. She had never heard anyone speak like that about her, especially not in a room full of people who seemed to think she wasn't worthy of standing next to him. The room fell silent. Every eye in the room turned to Ethan and Lena. The murmurs stopped, the laughter died. All that remained was the sound of Ethan's declaration, hanging in the air. Lena's breath caught in her throat as the realization settled over her. In that one moment, Ethan had chosen her. Not because she was rich, not because she had a name that carried weight, but because she was Lena. The world could judge her all they wanted. They could see her as a small-town girl, unworthy of standing beside someone like Ethan. They could whisper and point and criticize, but Ethan saw her. He didn't see her as a piece in the game of wealth and status. He didn't see her as someone to be judged by the world's standards. He saw her as the person she truly was, the woman he had chosen. Lena blinked back tears, feeling a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the glittering chandeliers above. In that moment, surrounded by a room full of judgment, she had never felt more seen, more loved. And as the room remained still, she realized something else too. No matter how much the world tried to separate them, nothing would ever change the truth. Ethan and Lena were not just a story for the tabloids. They were real. Their love was real. And nothing, not the whispers or the stares or the expectations of society, would ever take that away. Ethan Blackwell had always known what was expected of him. He was a billionaire CEO, an empire in his grasp, the face of power and wealth. He had been raised in a world of expectations. Marry someone who matched his status, someone with the right connections, the perfect lineage, the perfect name. It was a world where everything had a price tag, and love was no exception. People often tried to match him with women who shared his social circles, women who knew how to navigate the intricate dance of high society, women whose names were known in the right circles. But no one ever truly saw him. No one except Lena. She had entered his life with nothing, no family name, no social standing, no wealth. She was just a small-town girl doing a simple job, a house sitter. But she had given him something no one else had: kindness, loyalty, and warmth. For the first time in his life, Ethan felt seen for who he really was. Not the CEO, not the billionaire, not the man with everything. He was simply Ethan, and she was Lena. It was on a golden afternoon, as the sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm glow over the sprawling gardens of the mansion, that Ethan realized the depth of his feelings for Lena. They stood side by side, his hand gently holding hers, the quiet breeze rustling through the trees. The world seemed to pause around them. In that moment, everything he had been taught to believe about love, about society's expectations, began to melt away. "Lena," he said softly, his voice steady yet filled with emotion. She turned to look at him, her eyes reflecting the soft light of the setting sun. "I don't care about the world's opinion," he continued, his words clear and unwavering. "I care about you." Lena's heart pounded in her chest as she stared at him, uncertainty and hope mixing in her eyes. She knew what people expected of them, of him, and she knew what it meant for someone like her to be with someone like him. But in that moment, none of it mattered. Ethan stepped closer, his fingers gently brushing against hers as he spoke again, his voice thick with sincerity. "Stay with me, Lena." Tears welled in her eyes, threatening to spill over. She had never imagined that a simple house-sitting job would lead her to this moment of belonging, of love, of acceptance. For so long she had been an outsider, a girl from a small town who had always felt invisible in the face of the world's judgments. But now, standing in the garden with Ethan, she knew she had found something she never thought possible. She had found a man who saw her, not for her background, not for her past, but for who she truly was. She smiled, her heart swelling with love. "I'll stay, Ethan." In that instant, she realized that home wasn't a place. It was the person standing beside her, the person who chose to love her, to choose her despite everything. As time went on, Ethan and Lena continued to build a life together. They faced challenges, as any couple does, but they also found strength in their love for one another. The world outside their bubble may have tried to keep them apart, but inside their home, there were no expectations. Just two people, deeply in love, carving out their own path. Ethan refused to let society dictate his happiness any longer. He defied the very world that had once tried to control him, choosing Lena above all else. And Lena, once just a house-sitter, became a symbol of defiance, a symbol of the love that could overcome all. Years later, when people spoke of Ethan Blackwell, they no longer whispered about his tragic past or his reclusive nature. They didn't focus on his wealth or his empire. Instead, they spoke of a man who had defied the expectations of the world and chosen love over prejudice. They spoke of how he had found happiness, not in the world of the elite, but in the arms of a woman who saw him for who he truly was. And as for Lena, she had never been just a house-sitter. She had been so much more. She had been the woman who changed a billionaire's heart, and in doing so, had changed a society's mindset. No longer would the world see her as the girl who didn't belong. Lena Carter had carved out a place for herself in Ethan's heart, and together they had shown the world that love had the power to break down even the most rigid barriers. In the end, love didn't just overcome their obstacles. It had the power to transform a society that had once been built on division, one person at a time.